On June 18, 1178, 5 monks from Canterbury witnessed a strange phenomenon in the sky. They immediately reported it to the local chronicler, Gervais, who was curious about the world around him. He recorded that, quote, "From the midpoint of the division, a flaming torch sprang up. The moon throbbed like a wounded snake." According to a popular hypothesis, Gervais was describing the formation of the Giordano Bruno crater on the moon. But modern astronomers have their doubts. Just as today, they still doubt nearly everything. What Gervais meant was complicated by the fact that he quickly returned to more familiar earthly matters, examples of which include a terrifying hurricane, a less scary founding of a nearby monastery, and boring news of a church council being prepared in Rome. So, what did the world look like in 1178? Today's video is not just for medieval history enthusiasts, but especially for you, my fans of Paradox Entertainment strategy games. Let's get started. Catholic Europe. A medieval chronicler was an educated person. Just 300 years earlier, this was a rarity. The learned man of Charlemagne's time left behind few students, but by the 12th century, there was a real explosion in Europe's intellectual life. This new scholarship was born out of translations. Muslim Spain became a treasure trove of knowledge and texts. After Christians captured Toledo in 1085, monks flooded the city to look at new material. Their interests were in scientific treatises on natural sciences, mathematics, and astronomy. These treatises have been lost in the West but were available in Arabic and Greek. Gerard of Cremona was the leader of the Toledo School of Translators. By the 1170s, this group rediscovered at least 71 ancient books for the Catholic world, including Aristotle's Physics. Intellectuals of the 12th century thought about the movement of bodies, algebra, physics, and foreign languages as often as they pondered God. They were masters of foreign languages without even a Google Translate at their disposal. Yes, imagine that. People actually learned languages other than English back then. Part of their intellectual value was their willingness to teach students. Scientific centers like the University of Chartres in France began to appear in cities throughout the Latin world. These cities grew like weeds. In jurisprudence, Italian law schools led the way, particularly the oldest one in Bologna. When local lawyers proved Frederick Barbarossa's rights to the imperial throne, he was so pleased that in 1158 he granted them a charter. This was the first document in history to establish the status of a university as a new type of corporation. The word corporation is crucial here. It might remind you of drone deliveries, Silicon Valley, and rotary dial phones. To a medieval person, though, corporations were urban organizations of craftsmen and merchants. The universities and their cities were inseparable. Municipal self-government was taking shape in Europe in the 12th century. As cities grew, so did the rural population. Europe was in the midst of an agricultural revolution. Most advanced types of plows appeared. Oxen were replaced by horses. 3-field crop rotation replaced the 2-field system. Then, windmills and watermills sprang up across the continent like modern wind turbines. Most importantly, peasants were developing new lands. Peasant communities, local lords, and monasteries declared war on the forests. New villages and fields appeared north and south of the Alps. The forest, once a mysterious place inhabited by malevolent and benign spirits, became a valuable resource. On average, a peasant was in charge of about 54,000 square feet of forest per year. This is slightly less than a full football field. And here you are, still paying $3,000 for living in a closet. Entire peasant communities resettled to new lands throughout the 12th century. In some parts of Northern Europe, the amount of cultivated land increased by 1.5 times in just 2 centuries. But you can't escape the rules of the market. As the population grew, land prices continued to rise, but labor became cheaper. Each year, life became more and more expensive. This is something we can all relate to in our contemporary world. In most European countries, landlords gradually transitioned from labor obligations to monetary relations with peasants. Instead of forcing serfs to work their land, a type of endangered servitude close to slavery, they increasingly preferred to simply collect rent. During this period, money started replacing bartering. Talk about a revolution. Imagine what it was like to start using money after a lifetime of paying for services with a couple of chickens and a sack full of turnips. Wow. So, how were feudal lords doing at that time? To better understand this, let's look at an exception to the rule, a place which is well known to our friend Gervais, England. Briefly about feudalism, England and France. In England, since the Norman conquest, the king was the sole owner of all the land. William the Conqueror had once conquered England in its entirety, and he had no fine print in the licensing agreement to the kingdom. Every landowner, even if they only had a small patch of land, had to swear allegiance to the king in London, not just to their local lord. On the European continent, a completely different system was developing. In Western Europe, all local inhabitants, along with their possessions, were fully subordinate to the feudal lord. A feudal lord derived his power from his main privilege, the monopoly on public authority and justice. In France, a vassal was a subordinate to a higher lord only on personal level. He officially declared his loyalty to him, but was left alone to manage his jurisdiction as a local monarch. The kingdom resembled a nesting doll of states within states within states. Count Henry the Generous of Champagne province conducted an inspection of his domains in 1172. He was surprised that he stood atop a pyramid of 1,900 vassals. One might pity him. Champagne had not yet been invented, by the way, and a glass or two would have helped to figure it all out. Necessity being the mother of invention. The King of France arouses even more sympathy. Louis VII at that time personally owned only the area around Paris, literally the island of France, or Île-de-France. In the rest of the kingdom, power was in the hands of local rulers, like the Count of Champagne we just mentioned. They were only subordinate to the king if the two had good relationship. There was no discussion of royal tax collection or laws applied to their lands. In England, however, tax collection was handled by special people on the royal payroll. These were sheriffs, like the famous or infamous Sheriff of Nottingham. By 1178, a judicial reform was already in place. This allowed Englishmen to pay a special tax and send an appeal to the royal court. The Henrys laid a foundation for common law in the literal sense. Yes, Henrys, plural. Since 1170, two kings from the Plantagenet dynasty ruled England, Henry II and his co-ruler's son, Henry the Young King. Guess where the nickname comes from? Before ascending to the English throne, Henry the Elder had been the Duke of Anjou in France. He married Eleanor of Aquitaine, the former wife of the French king Louis VII. She was the sole heiress of most of southern France. Things hadn't worked out with the French king, no male heir was born. But with Henry, Eleanor had one boy after another. It became evident that they would inherit both their father's and their mother's lands. In the end, the Angevin family took control of about half of France. Relations within this family were far from ideal. By the 1170s, Henry's grown-up children, having received French duchies from their mother, had revolted against their father. So when your family fights, at least no one starts a dynastic war. Count your blessings, people. And if his sons weren't enough of a bother, Henry II also had to reckon with the church. Papacy and Empire, Frederick Barbarossa. In the 12th century, the Catholic Church was nearly at the peak of its power. The Pope was not just the head of the Christian world, but a true lord with claims to lands across all of Western Europe. Unlike other feudal lords, he had a special skill: the right to excommunicate rulers and entire regions from the church. Once, Pope Adrian IV banned the entire city of Rome. They were basically the ideal model for the high table in John Wick. Excommunication in the Middle Ages was social death, akin to being burnt at the stake. But that was only half the trouble. The excommunicated were forbidden to participate in the church sacraments, meaning no salvation of the soul. And if a ruler was excommunicated, his subjects were not obligated to keep their agreements with him. In short, the Pope had always a powerful lever of influence on any Catholic. Europe was becoming covered with a network of monasteries, some of which were directly subordinate to the popes. Bishops were also appointed by the Pope, although starting from the 12th century, he shared this right with the Emperor of the Holy Roman Empire. However, no compromises could prevent an epic disputes over authority. There were always reasons and causes for conflict. During the reign of Frederick I, Barbarossa of the Hohenstaufen dynasty, the empire began to be called Holy Roman Empire. As if to say, we're no less than your popes. The center of this Roman Empire was in the German city of Aachen. Emperor spent most of his life on military campaigns in Italy. There were as many as 5 such campaigns. Sometimes he had to suppress the autonomy of cities in Lombardy, and other times he tried to install his pope in Rome. Sometimes there were 2 popes at once. Yikes! Popes aplenty. In 1159, during the coronation of Alexander III, Barbarossa's protege ran up to him, snatched his mantle, sat on the throne, and crowned himself Victor IV. Another schism began. Barbarossa recognized Alexander III only after 17 years in exchange for lifting his excommunication. For the emperor, this was a profitable exchange. At home, he faced an ongoing legitimacy crisis. Emperors in Germany were elected. Some particularly ambitious local princes, like Duke Henry the Lion of Saxony and Bavaria, could challenge their authority. Over time, such princes would come to be called electors. Much later, they would receive formalized rights to elect the emperor. It's amusing that this red-bearded emperor managed to tame the Pope, all of Italy, and his own vassals, but in the end, he drowned in a stream during a crusade. Que sera, sera. Eastern Europe and Western Slavs. The Duke of Saxony could add to his CV not only the possession of roughly half of Germany, but also experience as a crusader. However, he didn't go to the Holy Land, but to the Wend. This is what the Germans called the Slavic pagans in northeastern modern-day Germany. In neighboring Poland, King Boleslav III divided the land among his sons into several parts in 1138. This was so his descendants were too busy fighting for power to engage in crusades. But the Germans, led by dukes like Henry the Lion and Albert the Bear, were raiding pagan lands from the late 1140s onward. This point in the story calls for a circus joke, but we couldn't come up with one, so now is a good time to take a break, suggest your version in the comments down below, subscribe to the channel, and hit that like button. Alright, let's move on. This is how the territories around modern Brandenburg became German, and the bear became the symbol of Berlin, even though they don't actually exist there now. By 1178, only the lion had survived from his pair, but the bear's son continued his father's work colonizing Slavic lands. Yes, military expansion quickly turned into colonization. Remember the population boom and land shortage? Well, moving to new territories became an opportunity for German or Flemish peasants to escape landlessness and unemployment. Similar story to that of the US founding and expansion. In Eastern Europe, there was more land and fewer people. During the colonization east of the Elbe, about 2,500 people arrived annually, making up about 2.5% of the local population. Today, this is equivalent to more than 150 to 200,000 migrants arriving in London each year. This is higher than the current rate of 100,000. In short, the lands east of the Elbe were a very popular destination for relocation. This migration was harnessed by neighboring Christian rulers. German settlers were invited by Duke Frederick in Bohemia and also Casimir II in Poland. By the 1170s, this process had just begun, but it already was bearing fruit. The Holy Roman Empire expanded eastward with the help of migrants, bringing Catholicism with it. It reminds me of Reconquista. Speaking of which, how are things in Iberia? The Pyrenees. The frontier between Christians and Muslims in Iberia moved in waves. The Reconquista would accelerate, then slow down. In the late 11th century, Toledo was captured. In 1147, Christians liberated Lisbon, but by the 1170s, everything had stabilized again. But as usual, not for long. Dynastic conflict hindered progress. The kingdoms of the Iberian Peninsula could not maintain a union. In the second half of the 12th century, Portugal joined the existing set of Castile, Leon, Navarre, and Aragon. By the end of the century, cities on the Mediterranean coast, such as Barcelona and Valencia, were rapidly growing and increasingly focused on trade. Honestly, when you look at how many vibrant, unique, and independent political forces existed in Spain at that time, it makes you wish someone would create a fighting game based on it, with a distinctive selection of characters. Obstructing the Reconquista were changes on the other side of the Gibraltar. Berber dynasties from Morocco were uniting in fragments of the Cordoban Emirate, known as the Taifas. Initially, this was done by the Almoravids, who adhered to a strict but moderate religious discipline. However, they were replaced by the more radical and ambitious Almohad movement, which sought stricter unification of Islam and broader expansion. But by the 1170s, the Almohads, led by deeply religious Yusuf I, had captured Spanish Andalusia and almost all of North Africa, including reclaiming the Tunisian coast from the Sicilians. Thus, from the south came the advance of Muslim Puritanism. In the north, the Christian movement was gaining strength. Religious radicalization led to curtailing of the famous Iberian inclusiveness. The Almohads began demanding the conversion of all Christians and Jews to Islam. Many prominent scholars and townspeople left Spain. For example, the family of the greatest Jewish thinker of the 12th century, Maimonides, first moved to Morocco and later relocated to Palestine and then to Egypt, where he became the personal physician of none other than Sultan Saladin. Sometimes the opposite happened, and people from afar arrived in the region. For example, the 69-year-old King Afonso the Great, the founding father of independent Portugal, was the son of a Burgundian knight and the great-great-grandson of the King of France. The Reconquista attracted many foreigners with its opportunities. For instance, you could conquer a piece of land from the Muslims, earn military glory, loot plenty of spoils, and do it all under the guise of fulfilling a noble religious duty, a holy war. A true oxymoron. Scandinavia and the Baltic. Palestine was not the only target of crusaders. In the 12th century, the crusading movement became pan-European. These enthusiasts set out to fight the enemies of Christ in all directions. Many volunteers came from Scandinavia. When the Viking era ended, their own kingdoms were solidifying: Denmark, Sweden, and Norway. The Viking Age was long over, and the raiding economy was in decline. They had to adapt to an agrarian economy which was difficult almost everywhere. In all countries except Denmark, local free peasants known as bonds worked the land. As everywhere, cities grew in the north. The center of Baltic trade at the time was the island of Gotland. By the end of the 12th century, merchants from growing German cities like Lübeck were establishing themselves. But for feudal lords, it was more promising to go on crusades. Yes, the Crusades are not just about sand, the Holy Sepulchre, unbearable heat, and a Ridley Scott movie. Sometimes they're more like landscapes, straight out of a Lars von Trier films. King Valdemar the Great of Denmark fought alongside the Germans against Slavic pagans, and even captured the islands of Rügen. Then the Swedes received papal sanction in 1172 to launch a crusade against the pagans in the eastern Baltic, Finns and Estonians. But this part of the region was contested not only between Catholics and pagans, but also by Orthodox Christians. Everyone was invited to this party. Rus and the steppe. The closest neighbor of the Swedes was Novgorod, which by the 1160s had become a republic. Feudal fragmentation was all around it. By the end of the 12th century, the Rurikan dynasty had divided into several branches. For example, Sviatoslav Vsevolodovich of Chernigov and Vsevolod the Big Nest came from different lines. By the way, Vsevolod's nickname, which references his 12 children, emphasized that he could have single-handedly solved the task of accelerating population growth. Genealogy is a complicated matter, but these princes were well versed in it, and as a result, laid claim to neighboring principalities. By the end of the 12th century, the strongest principalities were Chernigov, Smolensk, Vladimir Suzdal, and Galicia. Gradually, with each of them, a group of princes and boyars formed, and no one was in a hurry to occupy the Kiev throne anymore. The city no longer held such importance, and for the princes, their own lands became more crucial. Sometimes contacts with foreign neighbors were more relevant for Russian princes than matters in principalities on the other side of the Rus. Novgorod and Polotsk hired foreigners for service and collected tribute from the nearby pagan tribes. According to legend, craftsmen for the construction of the Church of the Intersection on the Nerl near Vladimir were sent by none other than Frederick Barbarossa. Yes, there was a time where these territories weren't separated by an iron curtain. Most contacts were familial. Danish King Valdemar and the elder brother of Krakow Prince Miecko III of Poland were married to Russian princesses. But Slavs enter into dynastic alliances not only with Catholics. Across the Dnieper and the Oka rivers, Turkic people roamed. The steppe was home to many different people. Some, like the Pechenegs, moved across the Danube, while others, like the Black Klobok, settled near Kiev. But the largest group was the Polovdzians, or Kipchaks. Russian princes initially fought with them, but after a couple of generations, relations became less toxic. Time heals, I guess. Despite the diversity of their neighbors, the inhabitants of Russian principalities saw themselves as part of a single culture. They had common saints like Boris and Gleb, and the entire region had one metropolitan, in Kiev. He was appointed in the center not only of the Orthodox world, but also of the Mediterranean, in Constantinople. Byzantium. The capital of the Eastern Roman Empire was the largest city west of India. The nearest competitors were far behind. In Cairo, the population in the mid-12th century, by the most optimistic estimates, reached 175,000 people. In Constantinople, it only dipped to this figure in the most pessimistic calculations. Most demographers speak of 200 to 400,000 people. As an any metropolis, people from different corners of the world could be found in Constantinople. These included Pechenegs and Varangian mercenaries to Arab traders. A rabbi from Spanish Navarre, who visited Constantinople in 1171, wrote that the Byzantines had gathered merchants, quote, from all countries of the world in their capital. The capital of Byzantium was a key trading hub that connected the Christian and Muslim worlds. In the 12th century, the Italians linked Latin markets to Mediterranean trade. The Venetians and Genoese were particularly active, securing trade privileges and coastal territories from Byzantine rulers. Cities of the empire, such as Thessaloniki and Corinth, quickly joined the trade networks. The economic growth spurred by the Italians helped Byzantium emerge from the crisis of the 11th century. Trade wasn't just about profits and friendly relations and other pony magical friendship. It is also about conflicts and competition. The concentration of Latins or Italian freeloaders couldn't help but irritate honest Orthodox taxpayers of the empire. These guests often caused disturbances. Genoese merchants brawled with Venetians and peasants right on the streets of Constantinople. In 1171, things escalated to the point where, after another skirmish, the emperor arrested several thousand Venetians along with their property and revoked their trading privileges. When Doge Vitali II failed to resolve the conflict, the people of Venice lynched him in an act of swift justice. The influx of, quote, barbarians into the empire led to a rise in anti-Latin sentiments. The image of Emperor Manuel I further fueled the fire. Even after banning the Venetians, he remained a true Latinophile. The emperor surrounded himself with Norman mercenaries, corresponded with Western rulers and the Pope, introduced courtly fashion at his court. He even brought in knightly tournaments. The guy wanted to have his own medieval times before it was cool. However, behind the mask of a Latinophile, he remained a true Basilius, who saw his neighbors as vassals in waiting. After reclaiming Croatia from Hungary, he brought the young Hungarian prince Bela to his court. He was renamed Alexios. He was raised in Byzantine customs and appointed as, quote, despot of Hungary, a Byzantine version of a vassal. Byzantium did the same with Stefan Nemanja in Serbia and Reuben III in Sicilian Armenia. Reuben lost an eye in battles with the Byzantines, and Stefan eventually became the founder of the Serbian dynasty. Bela Alexios eventually became the independent king of Hungary, Bela III, and remains in history as one of Europe's wealthiest rulers. Byzantium was the most centralized and bureaucratized state of its time. So while Henry II in England was just creating the system of sheriffs, the Romans already had a complex hierarchy of officials. Over time, the Romans developed an administrative system unmatched in Europe. It was as if other European kings were living in the Stone Age compared to them. Courts, municipalities, and tax inspectors in Byzantium operated according to regulations. The empire was clearly and stably divided into themes: military administrative units with self-government and the ability to quickly mobilize resources for the country's defense. If a couple of centuries ago, a bureaucrat, the strategos, headed a theme, by the Komnenos era, themes began to be grouped, and their administration was reserved for relatives and friends of the emperors. I must say, we're all incredibly fortunate that those dark times are behind us and that family connections no longer play any role whatsoever in the distribution of government positions. Right? Anyway, administrators turned into governors. They handled taxes, defense, and administration of the provinces themselves. Even the title changed to dux. It's almost the same word as its Latin equivalent from which the title duke originated. The Byzantine system was quickly sliding into feudalism. However, while feudalism emerged in the West due to the collapse of the early Middle Ages, in Byzantium, governors took control due to the degradation of the central government. The cities and regions of the empire realized that Constantinople needed them more than they needed it. But they all had to deal with the warmongering neighbors. One might ask if in this era there was any other kind of neighbor. The Seljuk Empire's collapse. To the east of Constantinople, the Seljuk Empire had existed for a century. By the late 1170s, calling it a, quote, empire would be an exaggeration. Sometime before, it had united the entire Middle East, except the Egypt, for the first time since Abbasid Caliphate's heyday. However, after a couple of generations, the Seljuk Empire had fragmented into numerous small states, some of which were no longer ruled by Seljuks. How did this happen? The Seljuks were a dynasty, and its members constantly sought to carve out pieces of the Middle East for themselves and pursue independent policies without regard for Merv. Merv in Central Asia was the seat of the formal head of the family, or the Great Sultan, until the late 1150s. Formal because the, quote, lesser Seljuks in the Sultanate of Rum in Anatolia or Iraq had become de facto independent states by the end of the century. Their rulers were already sitting on their own powder kegs of heirs. Sultan Kilij Arslan II of Rum had no fewer than 11 sons. What could possibly go wrong after his death? Well, besides the fact that he fell just a couple of kids short of earning the nickname Really Big Nest. But there's another reason for the crisis. Each son of a Turkic warlord had a tutor, an atabek. When the warlord took control of a country, it was considered a gesture of goodwill to appoint the atabeks as governors of its various regions. Predictably, as central authority weakened, their instinct for self-governance kicked in. There were no working instructions for atabeks, so nothing kept them from separatism. Atabeks governed their regions even when the sultans were already adults. For example, Seljuk Tuhril III, who ruled western Iran from 1176, couldn't shake off the tutelage of his atabek, Muhammad Pahlavan, who ruled in Iran and Azerbaijan after his father Ildegiz and indulged in all kinds of excesses. Really? In this environment, how was one to define excesses? Despite this, both the Seljuks and their pesky atabeks were minorities in their territories. Throughout the Middle East, the primary languages were Arabic or Persian, and Turkic served as something like a lingua franca for the ruling elite. The only exception was Anatolia, where a relatively large number of Turks, about 1/10 of the region's population, had settled. Anatolia's landscape allowed for a nomadic lifestyle, and there was always the opportunity to raid neighboring Byzantium, Georgia, and Cilician Armenia. As a result, the border between the Sultanate of Rum and Byzantium became a true frontier. The Sunni Revival. The collapse of the Seljuk Empire didn't mean that the Islamic world was in crisis. On the contrary, the 12th century was a golden age for Sunni Islam. In 1124, Caliph al-Mustarshid Billah stopped paying tribute to the Seljuks, withstood a siege of Baghdad, and became an independent ruler in southern and central Iraq. For the first time since the 9th century, the head of the Muslim world had real power. Before this, Baghdad had been the cultural and religious center of Sunni Islam. And by 1178, Caliph al-Mustadi was actively pursuing his policies from there, with the Ildegizid Atabeks in Iran and Azerbaijan and Saladin in Egypt as his allies. Speaking of Egypt, by the late 12th century, it was the last stronghold of Shiism. The Fatimid Caliph in Cairo was a direct rival to the Abbasid Caliph in Baghdad. In 1171, Saladin took over Egypt and expelled the Fatimids. As a result, the already widespread Sunni Islam became the only Islamic sect with a strong and independent caliph. Islam itself, spread by Seljuks, extended into Anatolia, approaching Byzantium. Significant changes were taking place within Islam. First Iran and then the Fertile Crescent became covered with a network of madrasas, Muslim schools and scientific centers. In Islam, law and religion are one, so graduates of these schools usually became ulama, scholars, jurists, and spiritual leaders, united into one. Ulama stood on the shoulders of giants. In the 12th century, people were reworking Aristotle's ideas, and words like algebra, algorithm, and alchemy, familiar to everyone, were borrowed by Europeans from Arabic treatises. Even Byzantine libraries were replenished with rare books translated into Arabic on medicine and mathematics. Most importantly, the network of Muslim scholarly centers was truly international. Jurisprudence professionals united into schools, or madhabs, which spread across the Muslim world. Scientific centers often arose thanks to immigrants from different parts of the Islamic world. The first madrasas in Egypt were founded by an immigrant from Muslim Spain. And when Cairo's ulama faced a theological dilemma, they sought an opinion from their colleagues in Baghdad. The Crusader states. In the 12th century, there were also Christian Crusader states in Palestine. Initially, there were 4 of them, like the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles: Edessa, Tripoli, Antioch, and most importantly, the Kingdom of Jerusalem. By the 1170s, only the last 2 remained. Edessa had been captured by the Zenids even before the Second Crusade, and the Counts of Tripoli had become vassals of the King of Jerusalem. The Crusaders, or Franks as the Muslims called them, were a minority in the kingdom. They almost always lived in cities alongside Arabic-speaking Christians, as well as a small number of Jews and Muslims. After the city was captured in 1099, few Muslims remained. By the end of the 12th century, the kings of Jerusalem were somewhere in the middle in terms of authority between their counterparts in France and England. They could sometimes pressure their vassals, but generally they did not interfere in their internal affairs. Additionally, the church, headed by the Latin Patriarch of Jerusalem, owned lands scattered throughout the kingdom. Jerusalem was a modern feudal state. The Crusaders were mostly from France and replicated their homeland's system of governance. Judging by the history of French colonialism, their descendants didn't really change this tradition. Independent and military nobility was essential to the kings. Their state was a besieged fortress, and after 1176, when Manuel I was defeated by the Turks at Mariocephalon, the Crusaders could no longer rely on even such an egocentric ally. The influence of the Romans persisted only in the Principality of Antioch, which the emperor regarded as a vassal and even appointed an Orthodox patriarch there. In response, the Latin Patriarch of Antioch, Amory, excommunicated the entire principality. He changed his mind only in 1170, when Prince Bohemond III restored him to his seat. The Orthodox colleague had been crushed by church debris during an earthquake. Despite all these difficulties, Jerusalem attracted many Christians. Philip I, Duke of Flanders, specifically traveled to the Holy Land to help his cousin, King Baldwin IV of Jerusalem, defeat Saladin in 1177. Italian merchants from Pisa and Genoa supplied the Crusaders across the sea in exchange for privileges and pieces of the coastline. Knightly orders, like the Hospitallers and the Templars, helped the kings defend Jerusalem. For them, it was the most important city in the world, not without reason. Medieval maps often placed it at the center. From this core of the Christian ecumen, let's return to its distant outskirts, in southern England. Conclusion. Taking a moment from his chronicle, Gervase of Canterbury in 1178 found himself in a world poised on the brink of a stream of significant events. A year later, the Third Lateran Council gathered in Rome, where the new Cathar heresy was condemned for the first time. Also, the rules for electing the Pope, which are still in effect today, were established. Another year later, Philip Augustus ascended to the French throne. He would greatly expand the royal domain and challenge the Angevin dynasty. A little more time would pass before St. Francis was born in Assisi, who would create a new model of piety in the West. A few years before his death, the future Thomas Aquinas was born to a minor Italian nobleman, and he would create a new model of theology, absorbing the legacy of the intellectuals of both the East and the West of the late 12th century. Roman law was rediscovered and universities developed. Christian expansion continued in Spain, and monarchies across Europe were gradually strengthening. And these are just a few examples related to Latin Europe. The entire world in 1178 was on a cusp of events we associate with the Middle Ages. It still had to endure cataclysms like the Black Death and events such as the Mongol invasion. But the outlines of the world that would face all of these transformations had already taken shape by the end of the 12th century. And yes, I know we didn't cover the entire world. So if you're interested in hearing about other parts of the globe or different time periods, be sure to leave a comment under this video letting us know which topics you'd like to see us cover next. And of course, don't forget to subscribe to this channel and give this video a like. It will help us grow this project and share even more fascinating content about world history. Thanks y'all, and I'll see you in the next one.